Hello, everyone, and welcome to another exciting, fun, and interesting edition of Training Unleashed. On behalf of the Learning Network, I want to welcome everyone to the show. I want to thank my sponsors, C-Suite TV and C-Suite Radio, and also remind everybody that we now are on YouTube. Go to YouTube and subscribe to Training Unleashed Network. Today, we're going to be talking about skills training. And this is an area we don't talk about enough because I have a hard time finding experts in the area of skills training, but we have a great one today. His name is Jeff Lenning, and he is the president of Excel University. So, Jeff, a lot of organizations truly need skilled, trained labor. And in the workplace, a lot of companies, I think, assume people have knowledge or assume people have the need for know stuff, don't really focus that much on it. What advice do you give people in the training department in the area of skills? And let me just focus the first question on how do people identify a gap in skills?
Yeah, so in terms of identifying a gap in skills, we get this sort of comment often, which is for new hires coming into the workplace. In my area specifically, which is Excel training, we find that the Excel skills are really lacking for new hires. And so a lot of people will just see based on their work product and the amount of time that it takes to do something as finding that deficient or where that skill can be improved.
So basically what I'm hearing you say is look and observe. Which I think makes sense. Sometimes people look at skills training as boring. How can you make skills training unboring?
So for me, in the classes that I teach, it's been a combination of gamification and a high degree of interactivity or interaction. And as an example of some of the gamification things, my son and I are gamers. We love playing video games together, and together we make like a really great team. But I was talking to him about how can I really sort of make a fun kind of story mode video game in the LMS so that it really challenges students to prove what they've learned and then motivates them to continue learning. So I took a long time setting up this really amazing gamification storyline where they have to apply the things that they learned in that lesson to unlock the next video of the story mode. And so that's made a really compelling case to make forward progress, but also make it very fun to learn the Excel skills that I teach.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, you're doing this in the actual training course itself. So it's not, because a lot of times people will do gamification in the LMS where they'll do certificates or they'll do badges or things. What you're saying is in the actual online training, you're taking something, and don't take offense, that most people consider very boring, Excel training, and making it fun for people.
That's 100% right. So we do badges, we do all of those common gamification things, but I call this actually like extreme gamification because I've built I went around town and shot all of these cutscene videos and they're locked. And then once you pass that quiz that shows, that you've been able to apply the lessons or the skills that you learned, it unlocks the next story mode video. And then you help campus security with their investigation is basically like the plot line.
Okay. So I'm going to ask you kind of a little bit off the wall question, but I know you've listened to the show, and so I ask off the wall questions every now and then. People writing training sometimes know too much. So they understand the jargon, they understand in your case, Excel really, really well, and they don't understand what they don't understand because they just know it. Where the learner, on the other hand, has this big gap. So not in the taking of the training, but in the development of your training, how do you avoid the issue where the subject matter expert is too comfortable and doesn't necessarily get as basic as they need to get because it's so instinctual and obvious to them, they don't even realize the learner doesn't know it.
Yes. So what I did for that in the course development stage is I created a list of in my case, the Excel skills that I wanted to teach. And then I created this dependency map where I basically said, I can't teach pivot tables because that assumes you know tables. And I can't teach tables until I teach. And so I can't share my screen, but it's a very big document and it maps exactly the exact right order to present every Excel skill in so that, like you said, I'm not taking it for granted that you already know VLOOKUP. Well, I can't talk about VLOOKUP till I talk about some ifs. And so I backed my way into it. So from the beginning, starting at lesson 1, there are no surprises. There's no technical jargon. I assume that you know nothing and I build it that way. And so what that also does is it means we circle back through the topics over and over, which provides some repetitive nature and reinforcement. And so if I teach concatenation, well, then I'll show you how to use concatenation with some ifs in a later section. So by developing it that way, it's been very successful for my students.
That's very cool. So a lot of people listening right now go, okay, this is very interesting. And this is about Excel. What advice do you give to people on teaching skills that maybe are about how to use their product? Maybe it's a different software product. Maybe it's their own, software product. Maybe it's a mechanical skill or something of that nature. What advice would you give them as to where to start? Because I think Excel, well, this is my own bias, is because I know Excel, it's pretty obvious. But if it's something new where no one's really exposed, what advice would you give them to say, this is how you sort of ideate what needs to be covered?
Yeah, so I spent a lot of time planning for that also, and I break it down into the small individual components before I start joining different things together. And so it takes a lot of planning, but I'll teach all the individual topics and then I'll show how they're all used together. So in Excel, that makes sense, right? Because any workbook needs a dozen or so Excel things working together to produce the objective that you're after. The other thing that I do that I find to be well received by my students is the format of the lessons. So it's the video, short chunks video, and then I deliver the homework so they can practice. It is so easy for a student to just watch a video and think they got it. But when I give them the Excel file and say, now show me that you got it, that's where the real actual learning begins. And then there's a quiz in every lesson, and then there's the additional resources. So I find that providing the lesson, plus the hands-on exercises, plus all of the answers to every exercise so they can actually troubleshoot when they're working on it, and then all the solutions videos and combining those together on an on-demand platform really helps my students.
Okay, so I'm working in a company, I'm working on my skills-based training, and I'm sure this is true in Excel and true with anything. Certain people are going to learn faster than other people, and certain people are going to learn slower than other people. I would think this might even be exacerbated with Excel because you're using something called numbers, and some people have number phobia. So how do you recommend teaching something where there could be different paces or levels of ability? Because you're dealing with it in Excel, which maybe is an extreme, but other people are going to deal with it maybe not as extremely, but still have to deal with that.
Yeah. So I thought through that a lot because, as you suspect, it's exacerbated in Excel because everybody feels that they've been using it for a while, so they have their approaches and they feel like they know how to accomplish certain tasks. But in Excel, there's many ways to accomplish any given task. Some ways are more efficient than others. So the approach that I took was I start at the beginning, assuming you know nothing, and then I give the students the ability to test through that lesson. And so that will really show me if they already know, let's say VLOOKUP, okay, They might know some of the things about VLOOKUP, but maybe not as deeply as I would like them to know. So I let them kind of go lesson by lesson, and they can test through it if they want and move forward. But that test will often find any deficiencies or gaps in their knowledge from where I want them to be.
I really like that concept of allowing someone to test through it. Because when I know something and I'm forced to take training, it's very, very frustrating.
Yes.
But I do think you make a really good point that not everyone knows it as well as they think they know it. That's not to say that some people don't know it really well. So let's talk about derivative training for a second. So you're training people on Excel, but there are a lot of people using other products. Google Sheets would be a good example. Do you do separate training on Google Sheets? Or do you do a training that says, hey, if you use Excel, hey, this is what you would do in Google Sheets? Or do you guys just focus on Excel, but if that's all you do, what advice would you give to somebody that is looking at using a derivative product?
Yeah, absolutely. So the good news in this particular case, but then I'll broaden it out. In this particular case, Google Sheets essentially copies a lot of the Excel functions. Meaning, if you learn VLOOKUP, XLOOKUP, or filter in Excel, that knowledge is going to apply 100% directly to Google Sheets. Now, Google Sheets has some things Excel doesn't have, and Excel has some things that Google Sheets doesn't have. But by and large, a lot of the functionality works in both places. I do want to then back up to another area of this, which is I really teach the skills that help people get their work done faster. In my specific past, it's been Excel, did a lot of the heavy lifting, but now I'm teaching things that are tangent to Excel, like that align with Excel, but that aren't Excel. And so there's a whole series of new lessons that I'm working through to cover exactly what you said, which is I'm an Excel user, but I also use these other tools that kind of integrate. And so that's the next sort of phase of the lessons. And so I find that explicitly listing those out so that they can make those connections through the class is going to be really helpful.
Yeah, I like that. That's very clever.
Thank you.
So updates. Hey everyone, this episode is brought to you by the Learning Network. Speed up your testing process with QuizBase, one of the Learning Network's many resources. Our well-structured quizzes are easy to customize and self-scoring. Whether you need a standalone test or integrate with products like Skillshare, QuizBase has the solution. Visit learning.net to learn more or to do a demo. Skills-based training, I know we're talking about a lot about Excel, but in any level of skills training, there are changes to process. There are updates to software. If your company's a software company, your manufacturer company. At the Learning Network, we work with a lot of people in the automobile industry. Their products are changing, etc. What's the best practice for training seasoned professionals on changes?
That is a challenge that I have faced for many years because there are so many different versions of Excel. There are versions that come out every 3 years. There are also the subscriptions, and those Excel versions are updated monthly, quarterly, or annually. Plus, there's different platforms, Excel for web, Windows, Mac, others. And so that has been a challenge. So the approach that I took was I talked about the sort of the core capabilities within Excel. And then when there is a new function that comes out, rather than go back in and re-record all of those core lesson videos, I supplement it with additional resources. And so that way, like let's say XLOOKUP comes out. Okay, well now VLOOKUP is kind of like null and void, but only to people who actually have the Excel version that actually has XLOOKUP. So by adding it as a supplement or an additional resources, as I call it, then people who don't have it still get the core lesson. And then people who do have it, then they can learn about that and then apply that to their work. So That's the approach I took for accommodating changes and updates.
That's an interesting approach. What I commonly see is people create a training on just the new enhanced features. But I can see in your particular case, you have such a matrix. There is no such thing as new enhanced features. You have enhanced features that vary based on each of the products. So having a library of supplements makes a lot of sense. Now, for some of our listeners who are not creating Excel training, where they just have one set of upgrades that they're having to deal with, whether it's their point of sale or their CRM or whatever kind of training, product training, it might make sense to do an update video and then every now and then redo all the training. But even if you're doing all the training, the people who have taken the training don't like taking the same training with updates. They'd rather take one, 20-minute update class than have to retake 4 hours of training with the updates in the middle of it. Does that make sense to you?
It does. And to complicate matters even further is if the training, the skills-based training are based on a web system, like a web software, then it's even harder because developers can make changes rapidly and then all of a sudden your videos are out of date. They don't look the same. They just change the design and then you're like, well, now my videos are stale. So that is definitely a challenge in this industry.
Yeah. Well, I think it is a challenge, and one of the difficulties, and I'm just going to say this for everyone who's listening that's into SCORM and into using software. If you design your training well, you can swap out your video training without having to change out your SCORM package. So you're tracking, it's not a new SCORM package, so you're tracking it simpler and easier. Now, sometimes you want a new SCORM package because the versions are so different. You want to track who took one version versus another version. But if you build your course intelligently, like we do at the Learning Network, I do that very rarely. You can change out the video separately from everything else so that you can keep track of what's happening, etc. And of course, it's still, video and doing video right is not the easiest thing. Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about online help versus training. So I know if I go into Excel, I can click online help. Now, interestingly, the number one reason why I go to online help is because I know there's a feature and I can't figure out where the feature is. But what do you say to the people that say, look, I know enough, I don't really need to go through the training because I can just get the help where I need to get the help, which, can be true with Excel, can be true with a lot of software, but also can be true with somebody who can say, look, and I know enough, I could just ask, a colleague and they can answer my question for me. Why is training better than people just sort of fixing potholes?
Yeah, let's talk about that. My biggest competitor is Google and now ChatGPT, because these are free ways to learn Excel and any other skill-based product that your listeners might be working on. But I found that these tools are great at answering a very narrow, specific question if you know how to search for it. It's not as good about telling you about things you're not aware of, like you don't know what you don't know.
Good point.
It's also not as good at creating a logical, step-by-step learning plan. It's random, independent tips and tricks. And I'm sure this is true for many other skill-based training, but with Excel in specific, there are many ways to accomplish any given task. And so when you do a web search, you're going to get 5 different ways to do this one thing. How do I know which way is best? How do I know which way is best given the context of the workbook that I'm working on? And so that's, in my particular case, the training shows them step by step. This is the approach that we use when we come to these types of things. And this is the progression and how the things fit together. So I see that's a big benefit of training versus getting random tips and tricks through Google search and ChatGPT.
Cool. So I'd love to have you tell everyone a little bit about yourself and the Excel University, because I'm sure there's some people here that have people that would like Excel training. But I want to just say this because I think it's important. It's really hard for companies to produce good quality training on, let's call it, ubiquitous software. Because a company like yours, which this is what you do, has many more learners, much more expertise. So I think it's important, not just for Excel, and I know you focus only on Excel at the Excel University, but lots of other kind of training can be created and purchased through various suppliers that provide training. So the training department can focus on things that are unique to the company itself. So I just wanted to point that out to the listeners, because I do think something like Excel training done right using a third-party vendor makes sense. So take time, if you could, to just talk about the Excel University and talk about how clients typically work with you.
Sure. Basically, in summary, the way that it came to be is I see a lot of Excel users using the do it like last year method. Okay. And
Yeah.
so a lot of my students are just, they're deadline prompted, they're under the gun. So they just want to get this project done by this deadline. And they're not as concerned with how it gets done. But when you have the Excel skills to see the best way to get it done, it really has a big impact in your efficiency. And for example, I was the accounting manager and I was required to do this monthly process called closing the books, the monthly close. And that was taking me 2 weeks, out of the month. And it was very stressful. I was working late nights, weekends. And by focusing on how to develop a process to enhance each of these workbooks, then that process went from 2 weeks down to 2 days. And so I developed basically the courses, and I taught Excel live, 8-hour courses, hundreds of sessions all over the country. And I was basically finding that I was saying the same thing hundreds of times a year. And so I basically sat down, I created that matrix of all the topics in the right order, and then I recorded all the videos, set up the homework, and set up all the quizzes, certifications, and all that. And so I set up a page, exceluniversity.com/tips, TIPS. And that's where any of your listeners can go to get onto my Excel Tips newsletter. It's a weekly newsletter. There's no sales. I basically give them an Excel tip, a blog post, and a YouTube video every week, and then I inform them, a few times a year when we do a webinar. The training is all on demand, and so it's on demand, self-paced videos, so you can change the playback speed, rewind, pause, do the homework, take the quiz, move to the next lesson. And then there's Zoom-based live office hours and study halls with my TAs, so that if they're working through and they have an Excel question or even want to share their workbook, we do those in these group live office hour Zoom calls. So that's a little bit about how I've set up the Excel University and what we do.
Now, I really love the idea of the tips in the weekly newsletter. I'm an Excel power user, although having said that, I probably only know 25% of the features. I know those features really well. So getting tips would educate me. So that's great. And, at least from what I can tell, you seem like a very nice person. So if your company is looking to train people on Excel, be a great place to go. Great person to reach out to. So Jeff, we always end the show with one tip. If you had one tip to share, what would that one tip be?
Yeah, so we get a lot of groups that come through the class, and so they might sign up 5 or 10 or 20 staff people to go through the course. And since the lessons are delivered on demand, people can work at their own pace. So my best tip for how to handle group training where they're all taking the same course is to have periodic student meetings live in the conference room, and basically make sure everyone's going through the content. So and how to apply the skills. So what it would look like is, let's say once a month, we're going to meet and we're going to review. Okay, everyone did lesson 101. Okay, any questions on the topics learned in lesson 101? Okay, now what workbooks are we going to apply what we've learned to, or what workbooks are we going to apply this to? And what that does is it keeps everyone going through at the same pace, so it's motivational, but also it makes sure that people use the same approach for their workbooks across the company, so that anyone can step into another workbook and understand how it was set up. In other words, Excel is like the Wild West, and anyone can set up any formula in Excel at any time without any consistency. So this brings a level of uniformity to all the workbooks. So if someone takes a leave or goes on vacation, I can step in and update that workbook because I know how and why you're using sum ifs. I know how and why you're using Power Query, and I know how and why you're using pivot tables. And so that is my tip for success in sending many students through the same program.
Well, it's an excellent tip because it applies to all training. So no matter what you're training, if you have a group of people going through the e-learning at a simultaneous time, to quickly put together a Zoom meeting, bring people together, have people share, exhibit knowledge is a very powerful tip. So I want to thank you for that. On behalf of the Learning Network, Jeff, I want to thank you for being a guest. I want to thank our listeners and viewers for listening and viewing. Of course, I want to thank our sponsors, C-Suite TV and C-Suite Radio. And again, remind everyone to check us out on our YouTube channel, Training Unleashed Network, and click the subscribe button. Take care and have a great day.